Good. Now, what was first entree into computer security type work? Was that at AT&T?
No, I started in school, actually. I discovered once an old paper I'd written for operating systems class. And when I took operating systems, this was in 1986 as a sophomore, we were told to do a project and to write about something that interested us about operating systems. And I found that I had written mine about security. But it was really when I got into my PhD, which I also did at Michigan, that we didn't call it cybersecurity back then. We called it applied cryptography and network security. And I decided, it's actually funny how I got into that. At Michigan, a lot of the funding comes from the auto industry. And so our lab was all funded by the big car makers. And I was working with that funding on something called automatic vehicle identification, which happened to be the initials of my name. So I go to conferences, people would laugh at my name, it was AVI's automatic vehicle identification. What I found interesting was every time they talked about a way to identify vehicles, like at a toll road, I was like, well, if you just do this, you could get free tolls. And so I started kind of hacking all the ideas. And my advisor said, you should maybe focus on this more, on security, because you seem to like to think about how to hack this and how to break things. And so I started studying that and reading it, and that's kind of how I got into it.
So hacking really was the first kind of instinct in this area. Huh?
Right. Not hacking the way you see it on TV or kind of like maliciously hacking, but I like to think of hacking as a broader term, as in, you could go to some club and they have some rules, and you're hacking their rules by figuring out a way of doing something that's not exactly the way they wanted you to do it to get some kind of an advantage, or hacking a situation. So just always kind of thinking adversarially and thinking about how you're going to get more than you're supposed to get.
Tell us a little bit about some of the early work that you were doing. So as you left academia and went and started working, what were some of the early computer security projects you were working on? So
I left Michigan and started my first job at Belcor, which was the Baby Bells research arm. It had split off of AT&T. And one of the projects I worked on there was called Billkeeper. At Belcor, my job was basically like to be an academic and do research and security, but they like to link you into a business unit. And so I got linked into a business unit that was designing a billing system for the Baby Bells for people to get their phone bills. And the reason they put me on there is they were concerned about security. And so working on how do you authenticate users. And just around that time, people were starting to think about giving online access to people to their accounts. And later on, when I went to AT&T, I joined the business unit in WorldNet and helping them design a way for people to publish their own web pages. So how could you do it in a way that somebody couldn't get in and change your web page, for example? Yeah. So authentication, one of the early kind of issues that you're working on. Yeah. Cryptography had been part of the work you'd done at Michigan, because I know you've always been in that area. Tell us a little bit about kind of some little views on how cryptography maybe has evolved from those years to where we are now. Well, the basic math of cryptography hasn't changed. I was very interested in grad school. I read a lot of books and a lot of papers and looked at the math of it as well as how it would fit into systems. One thing that's changed, obviously, are the key lengths. We don't use MD5 anymore, so some of the functions that we use. What I really find frustrating is, so I'll give one little personal thing about myself is that I'm a very serious poker player. So I like to go once or twice a year to Vegas, play poker, and it's a good way for me to gauge what average people who don't have PhDs in computer science or hanging out all day at a poker table are thinking. And lately I found they're all talking about crypto. I'm like, great, crypto, I know a lot about crypto, I'm interested in that. But what they actually mean is Bitcoin. They're talking about cryptocurrencies. And I tried to fight this initially. I say, sorry guys, when you're saying crypto, that's not really what you mean. But now I've sort of understand that's part of the lingo and you can't fight it. Do you put on a tuxedo with a martini and walk into a casino? No, you have the perfect poker face too, by the way. I actually put on a hoodie and torn jeans and try to stay nondescript. I don't cover myself with the hoodie or wear shades like a lot of people do, but I look a lot younger than I am. So last year I became eligible to play the World Series of Poker Seniors event. And I'm over 50, so I went in there, and people were trying to kick me out. They said, you know, you got to be 50 to play in this event. I said, I'm 50. And they said, no, you're not. And then every half hour, the dealers change because they're worried about a dealer maybe collaborating with one of the players. And so every half hour, a new dealer. And every time a dealer came to our table, they'd look at me and say, sir, this is a senior event. And I said, like, I'm senior. I had to pull out my ID every time. So.
How'd you do?
I did okay, but I'm still working.
So if we ever see a retirement party, if I get an invite to retirement, I'll know you hit it big at some casino or tournament
I have a deal with my wife that she lets me go to the World Series every summer. So the day I win the big one, then yeah, you'll get an invitation to the party.
Now let's talk cybersecurity, because you are an expert. You've had one caper after another. I remember one that you did this, you remember, but it was one where you guys drove around a neighborhood listening for baby monitors.
Nanny-cams.
Right.
Right.
I remember I was part of that little thing. We got on the NBC News.
That's right.
With that. Tell them about that was again, this
cool.
got one caper after another. This is an interesting one.
So when I worked at AT&T, I always tried to work on things that I thought were interesting and fun. One of my, I don't know if you remember Simon Byers,
of
one
course.
of our colleagues, had a British accent, was always afraid of TV, or I don't know really what his story, if he's a British spy or what, but he
had a cool look.
He had a really cool look. He dressed very interestingly, and he had a project in mind. He said, you know, all these nanny-cams people are buying. They were called X10.
Yeah.
So there's no security on them, and I'll bet if we drove around neighborhoods, we would be able to watch all the nanny-cams. I said, okay, let's do that. And we did it, and we went around, and we had a laptop and a bunch of gear that Simon had rigged up, and we were able to see babies, you know. So we decided that, you know, this could be a news story. We talked to the Hopkins now, at the AT&T public relations people, and they thought this would be interesting, and they called NBC News. And we ended up in a car with an NBC News camera driving around a bunch of neighborhoods. Simon refused to be on camera or even to talk, so then they pushed me up there, and I enjoyed it. Told all my friends, hey, I'm going to be on NBC News tonight with Tom Brokaw.
Yeah.
And so they aired the story on national television about how people are installing these cameras in their houses with no security. And they showed on my laptop in this car images of different babies as we drove around neighborhoods in Livingston, New Jersey. So.
The fake family was fun. It was a real family, but they had to be the posed family. It was so fun watching how that whole thing went. How
yeah,
they put
that's
that
when I learned
together.
that a lot of what you see on the news is sort of staged and rigged.
That was crazy. So is that still a problem today?
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, there are a lot of systems now that will use encryption. One of the early systems that Wi-Fi adopted for encryption was WEP. And actually in my lab, we broke WEP. We found a way to, given a Wi-Fi network, recover the WEP key, and then you have the WEP key. And so while there are many devices now that do encryption, they do them with default keys or with broken protocols. And so it's gotten maybe a little more sophisticated. You can't necessarily just go out and buy a bunch of X10 equipment and then see what's on all the cameras. But with a little bit of work, you can.
Now let's talk about some other capers here. How about election machines? You've had some experience. This is very topical.
Yeah.
What are these things secure, these boxes that we use to count votes?
So I've spent probably the most time in my career studying electronic voting and voting systems. The first time I got involved with this was in 2003, which was my first year. I left AT&T in 2002 and went to Johns Hopkins. And in my first year, I got a call from Professor David Dill at Stanford. And he said to me that, you know, he's not a security guy, but a bunch of activists, voting activists, have gotten their hands on the source code for the Diebold voting machine. And the Diebold voting machine at that time was being used in 37 states for voting. And just a little background on that, we all probably, I look around the room, everyone's a right age to remember the 2000 election where it came down to a few votes in Florida, right? And even though the problems with the election there had more to do with ballot design than with any other problem, Congress decided to appropriate $3.9 billion in the Help America Vote Act for the states to go out and buy electronic voting machines. So just imagine what happens in this country when all of a sudden the government is, we're going to spend $3.9 billion on voting machines. So everybody scrambles around and says, okay, they're going to buy voting machine, let's make voting machines. And there were a few small startups, one in particular that were building touchscreen voting machine. Never in their wildest dream did they imagine there would be almost $4 billion out there to buy these voting machines. And so this company got acquired by Diebold. Diebold was a very old company. They had actually designed safes and ATM machines and a very reliable brand. Yeah. And they realized that the government was going to be spending this money on these voting machines, so they bought this startup that made a Windows-based touchscreen voting machine. Now, when you're in startup mode, I've been involved in startups, I'm sure many of you have as well, the number one thing that drives you is to get your next release out and to try to sell it, right? And you don't spend a lot of time on QA, you don't spend a lot of time on source code review, you just kind of build a product and you push it out. And so the system that Diebold had purchased had a lot of problems with it. So back to the story, David Dill tells me the source code is there. We found it on Diebold's own FTP server. They had put it there because they wanted their techs in the field, if they needed to look at the source code, could access it. And so they put it without any passwords or anything.
Well, what year was this? 2003?
2003, yeah. Okay. So in 2004 was a presidential election year. And so it was early in 2003.
Did anybody cover this in the news?
It was about to be. Yeah, I'll get to that.
Okay, go ahead.
So I called in my grad students and I explained the situation that I had the source code for the Diebold voting machine. I didn't realize at the time that my own state of Maryland had just spent about $100 million on these machines and was about to release a big press release about how they were improving the elections in Maryland. And so we did an analysis of the source code. Yeah. We found things like these machines had two types of smart cards you could put in them. One of the smart cards you would put in would contain ballot information. If you're a voter, you're given a smart card, and you could have information like the ballot. The voting machine would load the ballot from the card and then display it for you, et cetera, and count the votes. Another type of smart card that you could put in the machine was an administrator card. And that would be something that the chief judge had, and they would put it in the machine, and they would allow them to change and configure and administer the machine. They could cancel out a vote if something went wrong. And this was supposedly good functionality. And in the source code, we found that there was a pin for that administrator smart card. So if it was lying around and someone found it and they just put it in the machine, it wouldn't allow them to just do whatever they wanted with the election. The pin was hard-coded in the source code as 1111. And there's a comment that says administrator smart card pin. That was the level of problem that we found in the source code. We actually came up with about a 17-page paper we ended up publishing in an academic conference of problems. And once again, I had that experience from AT&T working with the media. And so we decided that the best way to release this information was to talk to the New York Times with a reporter that I trusted there, John Schwartz. Now, before I did that, I consulted with an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and said, what is...
Let me back you up before, because we're going to come right back to the New York Times. Going through source code, give the folks a sense, is this, 1 million lines of code? Is this 1,000 lines? Did this require 10 graduate students? Are you with a cup of coffee for an hour? What do you have to do to find these kinds of problems? It to be like this great sleuth, or could anybody pick this up?
I think anybody with a lot of training in programming could have done what we did. And if you had a little bit of training in cryptography, you would have identified some of the problems we saw more quickly.
Old crypto using, or so sloppy library usage, or what?
For example, they were using cyclic redundancy codes, CRCs, which they were actually using those for encryption.
Yeah, not very strong.
They're not designed for that.
Right.
One of the funniest things we found was there was a section where they were quoting Bruce Schneier's book, Applied Cryptography, saying that we're using this as per applied cryptography. And then if you open up they're using a linear congruential generator, and it says we're using linear congruential generator as per Bruce Schneier. I think it was page 395, Bruce Schneier If you open it up, it says linear congruential generators should not be used for cryptography. So if you knew anything about cryptography, they were using static IVs, initialization vectors, for the data encryption standard, which had been broken in the late 90s. And so, you know, it was a few 100,000 lines of code, but we could zero in on the code that mattered pretty quickly. And
this was a startup in support of the Diebold folks.
Well, Diebold acquired this company.
They acquired the company. Where were they located?
I don't remember.
U.S.?
Yes.
Probably not big Avi Rubin fans.
They weren't for a while. In fact, getting back to the story with
the
lawyer,
back to New York Times.
I knew I had dynamite on my hands, right? Because, and I didn't know at the time that 37 states were actually planning on using these in 2004, and that my state was a big user of them. I just knew that these were actual voting machines. And so I was a little worried about what would happen. You know, would Diebold come after me? Was there even a trade secret, an intellectual property issue? So I knew Cindy Cohen. She's the legal director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I called Cindy, and they did an analysis as whether or not we should go to Diebold first. It's often, I have been involved in a lot of hacks where we hacked a commercial product. Like we did a Texas Instrument chip that's used at the ExxonMobil, the Speed Pass and car immobilizers. And in that instance, we went to Texas Instruments. They actually flew out and visited us. They met with Hopkins Counsel. And in that case, we told them, and then we said, we're going to publish this, but we'll give you a chance to fix it so that when we publish this, you know, it won't be the first time you hear about this. So the EFF, they did a legal brief as to the cost-benefit risk of going public without telling Diebold versus telling Diebold. And they concluded that if we told Diebold about it, they would get a temporary restraining order, and we might never get to tell anyone about this with an election coming in the next year. And so we decided, executive decision, and I also consulted with Hopkins Legal, and it made its way to the president of Johns Hopkins University. He called me into his office, and he asked me about it. And when I described the situation, he said, you know, we have medical doctors that do a lot of drug research. And from time to time, one of our physicians, and it's sort of funny how I came full circle. I'm not a doctor, right? But I wanted to be one. So when one of our physicians finds that a particular drug is harmful, it can kill people or whatever, and they publish that, very often the manufacturer will come after that person. And Hopkins is very good at defending them. And he said, we'll stand behind you, do what you need to do, this is great work, we're very happy that you did this.
That's awesome.
And then he says to me, as I'm leaving, sort of in a jovial way, he goes, don't get into too much trouble. And then he winks, he goes, well, you can get into a little trouble, but don't get into too much trouble.
I thought he was going to say, be careful when you turn your car on, right?
You laugh, but I have a story about that too.
Okay, we'll get there.
John Schwartz had done one of the nanny-cam stories and a couple of the other things I did at AT&T Labs. And one of the things I liked about him is that from a technical perspective, he really got it. You know, you can read a lot of stories in the newspaper and the media where the person describing the technology has no clue and they get it all wrong. And I wanted someone that was going to get it right.
Markov was like that,
Markov's
too.
very good. Yeah. But I knew Schwartz.
Schwartz was good, too.
Yeah.
There's a couple.
Yeah. So the story came out on the front page about the Diebold voting machine and a lot of things that he had found out that I didn't know about the widespread use of these, the amount of money that they had made selling them. And of course, the newspaper had to talk about the connection to one of the political parties from this company and all that kind of stuff, which wasn't my purview. I'm the technical guy, and I just report what I find. And so when that happened, Hopkins got a call from the state of Maryland saying, what are you guys doing? You know, we have a press release we're about to go live with about
the election people in Maryland.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the director of elections and a bunch of people in the governor's office, they were very upset because they had made the decision to buy these. And in fairness to them, they're not technologists, and they were trying to do good. They were like, our election is we're gonna lead. We're gonna have the most advanced, because in every other aspect of our lives, we like technology, and we're gonna be the first movers, and we're gonna put all this money in. And then this Hopkins professor is going to poop all over us. And so they were very, very unhappy. The Baltimore Sun, my local paper, was very unhappy that I didn't go to them, that I went to the New York Times. And for about 2 weeks, I didn't get any sleep. It was just nonstop news media outside my door. People wanted to talk to me, even in the academic community, as well as voting activists. And so it was crazy. And for 7 years after that, that's all I did.
So keep going. So what happened here? What happened with the machines?
So there were a bunch of hearings. I testified in Annapolis at the Maryland hearings. There were hearings in Washington. The federal government had just formed the Election Assistance Commission, and they had their first public hearing, and one of the big topics was voting machines. So I went in and testified. What was really interesting for me is, like, I don't have a degree in political science, and I found myself in very political situation where they would question my motives for doing this and for reporting this, and they would question my partisanship and my timing and everything about it. So even at the hearing, one of the other people testifying, who I personally believe had ties to the manufacturer, started just questioning my motives for doing this.
What'd you say?
I didn't always have a chance to respond. So in that situation, I spoke and then they spoke. When I did have a chance to respond, like on some TV shows that were call-in shows, I basically said, look, I'm a computer scientist, and I looked at the code, and this is what I found, and that's what I reported. I did take one other action, though, because some of the criticism was that I was an ivory tower academic, and I had no idea how elections really work. So I went and I became an election judge. I went through election judge training. And I worked 6 elections as a poll worker, and I learned. And I actually recanted a few things that I had said in the original paper, but I found new things that I thought were even bigger problems. And so I wrote like follow-on blogs and follow-on testimony. What was really cool for me as a computer scientist, Hopkins is about an hour drive from Washington, D.C. And so whenever there was a hearing or if somebody needed to talk to someone, there were a lot of people that they could have called. There's a professor at Stanford, and there's people all over the country. A guy at Iowa, that's Doug Jones, is really good. Not the Doug Jones from Alabama, he's just a different Doug Jones, who was very involved in electronic voting security. But they always called me because I could get in my car and be in D.C. in an hour. And I helped Congressman Rush Holt write a bill. Now, I didn't sit down with him and help him write a bill.
Jersey guy.
But yeah, that's right. Head of plasma physics lab, right, at Princeton. But the staffers, they would invite me and I would work with them. And he would walk into the room. And for me, it was kind of cool, right? He would come in, shake my hand, tell me how much he appreciated what I was doing. And then I would never see him again. But then I got to say that I worked with Congressman Rush Holt. So.
What did you find as an election judge? What are some of the issues?
First of all, if you've never done it, I strongly recommend it. It was, for me, I've always been civic-minded, and I've always, the first time I voted in an election, it was actually Bush versus Mondale, and I was completely overcome with emotion, just being at the polls and exercising my right. And so being a poll worker was the same kind of thing, although I had to be there at 5 in the morning. We had to set up the machines.
A lot of people were crying then too, but for other reasons.
So what was really ironic was the first time I worked as a poll worker, it was the Diebold machines in Maryland. And so I had to, they come in this box like this, and it's kind of a Rube Goldberg-ish thing. You turn it over and all these lugs come out and power cords come out. And one of the things I didn't like is they had to be plugged into each other serially. So like if one of them had a problem, I'm an engineer, a computer scientist. I kept finding other problems with the system, right? So if somebody trips over one of the power cords, all your voting machines are not going to work anymore. And what happened was Diebold had found out that I was going to be an election judge there. And the president of Diebold showed up at my precinct. It was a tiny little precinct. Normally get a few hundred voters there. And this was the primaries that I worked first before the general election. So the president of Diebold Election System walks in, shakes my hand, introduces himself. I knew who he was. He knew who I was. And a bunch of national TV showed up. But the head of the poll site, the chief judge, wouldn't let them in. So they had to be 90 feet outside of the polling place. And the truth is, I don't know if they thought I was going to pull some kind of stunt, because I think they viewed me as a troublemaker and that I was in this for the media exposure. And I was really just there to work and to learn and see how this process worked. One of the most interesting things that I found, though, was at the end of the day, there were these PCMCIA cards, now we call them PC cards, that were the place that the machine wrote the results to. And if you think about it, a voting machine is a very simple program, right? X equals X plus 1, right? Somebody votes for that candidate, increment the counter by 1. But there's a few 100,000 lines of code to do that. And at the end of the day, the totals are on this PC card. And part of the process is you take the cards out of each machine. And you've got to remember that, you know, despite, I guess, in that time I was in my 30s, and I brought the average age down by about 60 years of the poll workers, right? So they were all elderly, retired. That's who tends to do this. And I'm the computer science professor, and I'm young, so they wanted me to do everything. They were afraid to touch the computers. Only a couple of them actually knew who I was from, like, from the media and all that. And I didn't say anything to anyone about it that day. And so I took the cards from the machines one by one. We had about 6 voting machines, and I held them in my hand, and I thought, these are the votes right here for my entire precinct for the whole day. Now, I have seen the source code for these machines, so I know I could write one of these. I could have made one at home that had whatever results I wanted. And I didn't get vetted to become an election judge. Nobody did a background check on me or anything. I just signed up, went to the training. They're happy to have you, especially a young person. So here I am holding all of these results thinking, you know, I could do a swap. I could put these in my pocket, and now here's how I want this precinct to vote. And that's kind of scary because, you know, the cryptography that was used to protect these wasn't actually protecting the votes. One of the interesting things I thought is cryptography was used so incorrectly in these voting machines that it was scary. For one, they were only encrypting the audits from the audit information in the machine and putting it on there. Second, think about this as a security architect. Do you want the cards that have the votes on them to have anything encrypted on them? My first suspicion, if I saw that, would be that there's code on there, right? Because it's encrypted. We can't get at it. I don't want anything that I can't look at that's not transparent going into this voting machine, which could then maybe decrypt some code from it and run it. And so the voting machine might pass all the audits, but now the card's introducing some code to it. So they were using bad cryptography, broken cryptography, incorrectly for the wrong things. I mean, it was really, really horrible.
When you all saw Avi sit down here, you thought, here's this nerdy, boring professor from Hopkins, probably one of Ed's friends. You weren't expecting this, right? I'm telling you that. So what do we do?
I want to get back to nerdy. What do you mean?
You know, you get the point.
I mean,
I knew that, and there's another story I want you to tell in a minute. But so what do you do if you're sitting talking to the president? What do you say? So what should we do?
So things have come a long way since 2003, 2004. Today, only 6 states are using fully electronic voting machines, and 36 states have partial. So one of the security measures that we have in our elections is that it's up to the states to decide how they're going to vote. This is a good thing, because if every state had one universal system, and there was something wrong with that system, then one attack could bring everything down. So the idea with diversity is that the Georgia system might be really bad, but it will only affect Georgia. And even within many states, the counties can set up their own voting machinery. And so a lot of states have different systems in different places. The number one thing that the voting academic community that I'm part of decided to go after, we had a decision to make, right? We knew that there was a big problem. We knew that this was a problem that was not always easy to explain to people who were not technical, but were the ones making the decisions. And so we had to pick our fight. There were a lot of battles we could pick. The cryptographers were all designing these super fancy, crypto-verifiable universal systems, but I could barely understand it, much less explain it to someone. And so in a voting system, you need, for the least educated common denominator part of the population to believe that it's secure and that it's trustworthy. And a bunch of academics saying, trust me, we did the math, it works, is not necessarily a feel-good thing. So we decided that the battle we were going to fight is we want paper ballots. We thought that was universally understandable. You have a piece of paper, and you put your vote on it, and then you count it. And I will say this, that I think that we largely won that. Most of the country, including all of Maryland now, have paper ballots. We still have some problems, though. We still have some very big problems. 99% of the paper ballots in the US recent election were counted by a machine. Okay, so we still have the problem that if that code were compromised or rigged or problematic or even buggy, we might get the wrong answer. And so in addition to paper ballots, we've designed, and I say we, my academic community collectively, has designed statistical tests to decide how many precincts have to be recounted. And it's not enough. I'll tell you some of the stupidest ideas that I've ever heard came out of this voting thing. So I was in a hearing, and one of the director of elections was explaining how they do recounts. They had electronic machines, and they say, you want to recount paper ballots, we can do it. And it's like, how? Okay, well, we have our results in the machine. Let's say it says 500 results for candidate A and 300 for candidate B. We print the machine, the voting machine with the results, prints out ballots to match the total inside it, and then they hand count them. I mean, that is the absolute most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, right? You know, if you've got the wrong results in this machine, printing those wrong results and then hand counting them is not going to fix anything, right? So, so the idea is we needed to come up with a method for running an election that could be accepted, understood, and secure. And we think it's paper ballots with some statistical amount of surprise recounts. Very important that you not determine before the election where you're going to do the audits, right? Because then you only don't cheat there. And so what you do is when the election is over and the polls close, you randomly pick a bunch of precincts. That randomness had better be secure. Ron Rivest, the RNRSA from MIT, very involved in all these efforts, suggested dice. You know, just have a public showing, a bunch of people come. You know, as someone who plays poker, I can think of like loaded dice and all these other problems. If you could predict in advance where the random auditing will happen, you could cheat in the election, right? So we need to find a way, maybe ping pong balls popping up just like they do in the lottery, something like that. And they're not doing it. They're not doing random audits. And so 99% of the votes are, paper ballots are counted by machines that are not being audited. So we're not there yet, but we're in a much better position now than we were when we had a fully electronic. Let's forget for a minute about the Diebold source code. Let's say that Diebold had designed perfect source code, right? They had a bunch of really good programmers. They did QA, and there were absolutely nothing I could have pointed to in that source code that was problematic. This would still be the absolute worst possible way to vote, right? You go up to a computer. The computer is sitting there all day, and people are coming up and voting, and at the end of the day, the computer is telling you who won. There's no reason to trust a system like that. You cannot do recounts. You cannot do audits. You just basically have to believe what the machine said. And so I think they actually did us a favor by having such a poor software that it allowed us to raise the consciousness and say, these machines are really bad. We didn't have to argue, these really good machines are a bad concept. We had to just say, these machines are terrible. Let's use paper.
Does it worry you? I mean, we heard Dick talk about our society being run by computing. And here we're trying to do x equals x plus 1, and we can't trust it. Something seems wrong there. It seems like, and I actually asked Ron Rivest, he did a guest talk at a course I was teaching. I asked him about the election stuff, and he said paper ballots. It was what you said, and I remember thinking, if like the Henry Ford of cryptography is saying we should be using paper for elections, then what about things that are more consequential than elections? You know, things that really can affect human life and safety and so on. Do you worry about that?
So I think we need to separate out. I really truly believe that voting is a unique type of application compared to other things. And the reason is the anonymity requirement. People say to me, well, we do our banking online and we use, you know, banking use all kinds of automated systems. What's wrong with that? And I say nothing because of the safeguards that you can put in place. But how many of you would do your banking if the bank had a property that was required not to link the identity of the banker to the account, right? If you could never have any way to claim that that's your account because your vote has to be anonymous, we couldn't do online banking. We couldn't do electronic banking. I'm a believer in progress. I have a very, very smart home. You know, I love to buy these gadgets, and I'm sure, you know, the Chinese could change the temperature in my house if they want.
Baby monitors in your house?
No, I don't have any more babies.
Okay.
They're older. But I feel the trade-off, you know, the real risk isn't so much that somebody is going to turn on the lights in my house on and off when I'm not expecting it. It's that they'll use those devices to launch distributed denial of service attacks, and that all these can be part of some big botnet. That's one of the big risks. Yeah. But to me, you know, it's a lot of fun to automate my house. And I think when I do the risk-benefit analysis, I decide, yeah, I'm going to play around with these things, and I'm going to have a smart home, and this stuff's really cool. At the same time, you know, how could I be this early adopter that loves to use technology for everything, and I don't want to use it for voting? And that's because I don't think we can use it for voting. I ran an experiment in one of my graduate classes. I had the students build a voting machine. I had them break up. This was a semester-long project. And I put them in groups of 4. And I said, I want you to build 2 versions of your machine. I want you to build a voting machine, very, very simple voting machine, that will work just fine. And then I want you to build the same machine with a backdoor in it. And a backdoor that only you know how to trigger. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the 2, everyone has to turn in both of these machines. And that was half the semester. And I need all of your source code. I need your build environment. I need everything I need to take this, put it on my computer, run make, you know, compile everything, and run the voting machine. And I want you to give me both versions. And then I handed every group 3 voting machines. And I said from each other group, and I said, you're going to get 3 voting machines from 3 of the groups in the class. Some of them are the legitimate ones, and some are the backdoored ones. What I actually did was gave every group 2 backdoored ones and 1 non-backdoored one. And so, but they didn't know that that was the breakup. And I said, the rest of the semester, you're going to analyze these, and you're going to try to find the backdoors. And you can if you find someone's backdoor, you get some points for that. If you find a backdoor in one that wasn't backdoored, but actually was, you get an extra credit for that. And if you put a backdoor in that nobody finds, you get extra points. So there was a whole different way to get points. And these were all very smart students, some PhD, master's students in an advanced class at Johns Hopkins. And I was actually curious to see what happened. One of the groups did a That's 70s Show themed voting machine with candidate pictures with wild, colorful hair. And that's really cool, except what they did was they hid their malicious code stealthily in the JPEG images of the hair. And they had something in their build environment that copied a hidden file into this directory, executed this over there, caused that to there, to decrypt the hair, and then get the malicious code and then change the election results. Nobody found that one. And then they did demos. They came up in front of the class, and we ran an election, and we came up and we voted, and then it produced the wrong results. It was actually pretty shocking to see that nobody in the class, they all had all the source code. They all knew that there was a backdoor probably in there. So think in the real world, when you are an auditor and you're monitoring election code, you are going to assume, most people would assume there's not a backdoor in there. That's just the way people are, right? We're going to look at this, we're going to evaluate it for a while, and then we're going to give it a stamp of approval. Maybe we'll find some things wrong in the code. But they don't think there's going to, my students knew there was a backdoor in there. They had all the source code, and they were specially trained, and I would venture better trained than a lot of the people probably doing the actual reviews of voting systems, and couldn't find it. And my thesis and my conclusion from this experiment is it's a lot easier to hide malicious functionality in code than it is to find it. And that's one of the reasons I like paper ballots, because all that goes away if you're not having to trust a computer.
It is amazing. I asked Whit Diffie that too, and he said paper ballots. Seems like that's the consensus. Good heavens. Let's shift a little bit. You had some weird things happen over at Hopkins recently. Email kind of stuff?
Yeah. I was telling Ed this story. We had a department chair at Hopkins who finished his time as department chair and immediately went on sabbatical, which is what you do to recover from that experience usually. And so now we have a new department chair. Last week, I get an email from a former department chair saying, Avi, are you available? And email from him, I'm like, that's not an email you want to get, right? Because he's not asking me if I'm available to go to a football game or do something. I know I'm really busy. I got to do this thing in New York. I don't know. So I write back and say, it depends. What's going on? And he says, I really need you to do me a big favor that I think only you can do for me. It's my department chair. I'm like, okay, so what is it? I'll do it. And he's like, thank you so much. I understand that you're busy, but if you can do this for me, I'll really appreciate it. So I write back. I say, okay, what is it? And he says, I'm stuck in a meeting. I'm not allowed to take phone calls, and I really, really need my son's best friend's birthday, and I'm taking my son to the party after work, and I need you to get a gift for him and get it to me. Can you do that? And I'm like, well, where do I need to go? And he's like, you know what? I'll make it easy on you. Could you buy 5 iTunes cards, take them off, scratch them off, and take a picture and send it to me? And then I said, well, no, I'm too busy to do that. That doesn't seem like a reasonable request. And he says, please do that. I need you to get 5 $100 gift cards from iTunes. And then that's when I said, okay, this does not seem legitimate. So
What did the send say on the email? Where was it from?
It came from, his name is Yair Amir, former department chair, and it came from yairamir@gmail.com, yair.amir@gmail.com. So it was from an email that I thought was him. Yeah. And at this point, I'm like, well, if that's a phishing attack, that's a very directed kind of spear phishing attack. Like, he knew my name, he knew that I worked for this guy and all this stuff. And it was hard to believe. So I started composing I have a cell number. I started composing a text saying, did you just send me a request? And before I hit send, I actually paused, and I'm like, if he really did, then he's going to be like, I'm questioning him, and he wants me to do this thing for him, and I don't know. And I'm like, what am I thinking? He would never ask me to do that. So I sent the text, and sure enough, he goes, oh, yeah, another one. So I sent an email to our entire faculty list saying, has anybody else gotten strange requests from Yair? And half of them had. But what really got me thinking is that this is the first time that I had been personally the victim. I mean, we've all gotten like, I'm in Nigeria, and I need you to send me this and that. But this was like someone that I would normally do whatever for. And I also thought about, I'm a tenured professor. Imagine if you're the secretary or an untenured professor, and somebody in an extreme position of power to you makes this request of you, and you're just going to do it. And I have to say that I was really awed by the how hard it was for me to make that flip. And I'm a security guy, right?
Right.
And I made that flip in my mind that this isn't real. There's something wrong here. In fact, one of my emails to him was, could you tell me something that only Yair would know, that I would know?
You said that.
I said that. And he wrote back, he said, stop messing around. I need you to do this for me.
Great answer.
So yeah, he kept up the charade. So there was actually somebody sitting on the other end there communicating with me. This wasn't, I'm trying to hit 10 million people and maybe some of them will send me some money. They were going after me. So this was really quite an eye-opening experience. And if it's happening to me, it's happening everywhere.
How many people bought the cards?
Well, first of all, this is not something most people admit. So if they fall for it, I don't think
especially the computer science department, right?
I don't think we'll ever
I bet
know.
you could find out. Knowing you, I have a feeling you're going to get a job at the company that sells those and figure it out.
I mean, for all we know, Apple was behind this, right? They're selling more iTunes cards.
Oh, my goodness. I want to ask you one more question, then I want you guys, I'm sure you'll have questions, certainly about the election stuff. We talked about young people getting into computer science. You and I both been academics in comp sci for a long time. What advice do you have? I'm sure most of the people here have sons, daughters, nieces, friends, nephews.
Yeah.
What do you usually recommend?
I have a 16-year-old son who wants to be a computer scientist. When he was around 10, he was my pet project. I taught him programming in Python, and since then he's taken like 6 college-level courses, and he loves it. He had an internship at my company last summer, and he's going to work at APL this summer, hopefully. A lot of my friends that I know because of, they're the parents of his friends from school, they come to me and say, my kid wants to get into computer science. What can I do? Do you have any internships? And it's a tough situation sometimes because I really want to help them, but their kid isn't someone I really know, or no one's going to really hire a kid with no experience as an internship. So the first thing I would say is if you set your expectation that you're going to be a volunteer, you can have a lot more possibilities. So work in an unpaid internship shadowing somebody maybe. And there are organizations that are willing to take on a young, energetic person. And you may be bringing coffee in, you know, to the office, but you may also get to sit in on some talks and you know, do a lot of reading. And if you're really interested, I think you just pursue it doggedly, right? Besides reading the popular press, get an intro book in computer networks or in operating systems. And if you just read something like that, you'll know enough to be able to have a first conversation with someone and to be able to break in that way.
For high school kids, do they have to be good at math, good at science, good at, you know, whatever computer science courses they have to get into a career in computing? If a kid likes history and English and Latin, is that a non-starter? I
think sometimes the best computer scientists come at it from something non-STEM. They tend to be the kids that are more open-minded, more creative thinkers, and they have a more holistic view of the world, so that when they do learn the science and technology and the math, they actually can put it in a context that a kid who's just focused on the math can't. And so I like to see that. But not everybody has the aptitude. I mean, there is a certain amount of skill that's required in order to get through math and computer science and programming. And not everybody has it, but I think a lot more kids have it than think they have it. I think there are a lot of kids who are scared of it, and then when they get a little exposed to it and they find out how much fun it is, and I think programming is one of the most fun things there is mentally to do. If they're taught it by someone who has a passion for it and who loves it and knows how to teach it, I think a lot of kids can surprise themselves.
How do you feel about online stuff? And in general, how do you feel about online teaching and learning?
I will never leave the classroom. I mean, the reason I am a professor is that I love teaching in the classroom. That said, I've come around a little bit because of my son. So after I taught my son a bunch, we put him in Hopkins CTY online courses. These are Center for Talented Youth, where they actually have teachers who give these lectures. It's very interactive, and then they have 1 hour a week where they can talk to the person in real life. But they watch these lectures, and I watched him do these, and I was a huge skeptic, and I was really only doing it, you know, to see how it went. He learned so much from it that I flipped. And while I will still never do it myself for my teaching, I will teach in the classroom, I think there's a lot that you can learn online. And I'm amazed at the creativity that a lot of the people who have created online content have developed in getting that content across. So the medium, I initially hated it because I thought it was impersonal, and teaching is about interactions and seeing the students and questions. But if you're just interested in learning something, I think there's a lot you can do online.
Interesting. What questions do y'all have for Avi? If you're doing paper, you know, it's a pretty practical question. How do you deal with a big stack of paper? What do you do? Yeah, good question.
It's a great question. The way it's currently done is, and I just voted in Maryland on a paper ballot. They have a big scanner. It's a machine. It's got code in it. I don't trust it one bit. They take the ballots and they feed it into the machine. The missing piece is, like I said earlier, they need to, after the election, before anyone takes anything away, you've got this big bag on the back of the machine with all the ballots in them, and you've got this machine. You need to pick some of the precincts. The statisticians, there's a guy at Berkeley who did a great job with this, have shown the likelihood of cheating for different percentage audits. So let's say you audit 5% of the machines. The odds of there being widespread cheating, you know, is below 99%. So you don't have to do that many. But if you find a discrepancy when you do your 5%, you have to double your audit. Now you got to do 10%. If you find another discrepancy, you got to do another one, and after that, you pretty much have to recount everything. Recounting is very, very hard. Every ballot probably has like 40 decisions on it, right? You got president, you've got senator, you got Congress, and then you got all these local issues that people are voting on. A typical ballot will have over 30 decisions that the voters are making. If you think about sitting there and counting 500 of these, or in some places in California, 8,000 in the precinct, and you have to count each different race, or maybe you decide you're only going to focus on the national races, that's a lot of manpower and a lot of hours to do it. So one proposal is that you bring in another machine from another manufacturer that has been built to the specification of this, and you audit the machine with machines. If you think about the exponential blow up you get in the ability of someone to cheat, how much more difficult it is to cheat if you're going to be counting it with two completely independent and different machines. How you arrive at those might be challenging, but that may actually work better than manual hand counting, which, by the way, is the most mistake-prone process we have. So you're never going to get two people to count a stack of 8,000 ballots and get the same answer. That's not possible. People just aren't that good at it.
Have you ever studied the ergonomics of how ballots are designed? And so what sort of conclusions have you come to around design of ballots?
Yeah, so remember that we're in the boat we're in basically because of a ballot design problem. In the West Palm Beach ballot, you had the candidates' names on the left and the right, and you had little dots in the middle, and you had to select which one you wanted. And so you had Bush over here, and you had Buchanan over here, and you had Gore over here. And so in this very Jewish neighborhood in Florida, Buchanan got all these votes. And why is that? Because clearly they misunderstood, just going on the demographics and the knowledge we have of that community, they misunderstood Gore and Buchanan. And so the proponents of electronic voting machines say, well, you can fix all ballot design problems by having a touch screen, right? You have a touch screen, you actually are touching the name of the person.
Yeah.
First problem is, it's actually not trivial, the human factor design a ballot. For example, there can be a much more pronounced bias towards voting for the first one on there in a touchscreen voting machine. On the other hand, on a touchscreen machine, you can randomize it for each voter, and so that might be something worth doing. I don't think that we have to lose that capability. The ballot system that I believe is the best one actually involves a touchscreen voting machine, but it's not a counting machine. So what you have is you have a touchscreen voting machine with all the candidates' names. You have the human factors experts design the ballot for you, whether you randomize it differently for each voter, whatever. You do what you got to do. The voter selects their things, but at the end of the day, instead of cast vote, the button says print ballot. And that machine, all it does is it takes your inputs and it prints out a paper ballot. Now you look at it. If that's not how you voted, you take it to the election officials and you're like, the thing did not print the way I meant for it to. Tear it up, try again, still didn't, okay, mark it by hand. It's a ballot marking machine, not a voting machine. And then you can get all the advantages that the proponents of electronic voting have for the design is use a ballot marking electronic machine, it prints out a paper ballot, and when you walk into the polls, instead of paper or plastic, you're asked, would you like to fill out your ballot by hand or by machine? You want to fill it out by machine, you mark the ballot machine, it prints out your paper ballot. Regardless of how you filled it out, that way or by hand, you walk over to the scanner, you put it in the scanner, it keeps it, and then we audit some of the machines.
Anybody doing that?
There are some places that are doing that. I don't have those statistics, but I will point you, if you're very interested in this, to the best organization I know. It's nonprofit, I'm on their board of directors. It's called Verified Voting Foundation, and they gather everything for every state, all the statistics you could ever want about what's being used, what are the best systems, et cetera. It's verifiedvoting.org. I don't know if there's a dash, but if you just Google Verified Voting Foundation, that will be a treasure trove of information. Ron Rivest is on the board of directors, and several other well-known people as well. I haven't looked at anything as much as I've looked at voting, but I have looked at phishing quite a bit. More recent interest based on what happened to me last week. I think that phishing is going to, here's a dire prediction that I have. And it's one that I don't necessarily know if it's going to happen or not. Maybe prediction's not the right word. Maybe this is a possible scenario that we could find ourselves in, where you basically cannot ever trust any email that you get, right? Because you've got the bad guys doing machine learning. They're having actual manual people sitting there ready to interact with you. They have probably been able to steal a lot of your former emails. So the phishing decision used to be, do I trust this email? Well, it looks like a Nigerian scam, right? They want me to wire $10 million to Nigeria. I'm not going to trust this one. Now it's like, okay, last week I sent Bob an email talking about that party we went to. And today I got a reply to that email from Bob talking about that party and asking if I could please send him, $100. Well, you're going to be much more likely to believe that than this Nigerian scam. And we're getting to the point where these phishing attacks can be so sophisticated and bring into bear so much context and so much knowledge about what you've done before and what relationships you have with people. I'll tell you another story. My cousin sent me a friend request on Facebook recently. And we're already friends on Facebook. So I'm like, let me take a look at that. And I looked at his Facebook page from the new request, and he only had 2 friends. But he's a very popular guy. You know, like, he's got hundreds of friends. So I wrote to him on a text, and I said, do you know that there's been a Facebook page created that's sending out requests? He had heard about this already, and on his real Facebook, he said, don't reply to Facebook requests from me. Why in the world would somebody do this? Well, if they can build up a network of your identity with all of your friends, which someone could go out there, how could you stop it, right? They go out and they take some permutation of your name. Maybe you didn't use your middle initial in your real Facebook page. So they create a Facebook page with your middle initial. They put a picture of you there, which they had done to my cousin. They send friend requests to people that they think you know. And now they start building up where they actually have 100 friends that are actual friends of yours, but they control this, and you don't even know about this identity. And so now that identity can start asking for things from people that it knows, and you can see where this would go.
I mean, is the responsibility on the social media companies to deal with that problem?
I'm not sure. You know, as someone who worked at AT&T, and there's the whole issue, do you blame the network for bad things that happen on the network? It's a similar question, and I think that's more of a policy question than I'm prepared to answer. But I think it's up to them to do what they can to provide tools and to maybe have a fraud department that's looking for things like that. But whose responsibility at the end of the day? I think as individuals we have to be vigilant, and we have to monitor our own social network presence. And you know, hopefully they can do something. But I worry that we could end up in a scenario where you really just don't know what you can trust online. And again, the people in this room are much more likely to be attuned to a lot of these problems. When I think about, you know, my dad, and you know, he's an English professor, and he doesn't know that there are all these threats out there. And when he gets an email from a friend, he's going to totally believe it. Great. So I did election security, voting system security for about 7 years. And for the last 8 years, I've done medical device and medical record security. So it's a perfect segue for me. It's a great question. I think that I made the decision after 7 years that I had reached the point of very fastly diminishing returns when it comes to my research with voting. You know, okay, use paper ballots. Now, I can't only say that for like a few years. And so I decided that I needed to do something else. And being at Johns Hopkins, large medical school, I decided to study that. And as I looked at this field, I was amazed to find that of all the verticals that I had looked at, financial, you know, transportation, communications, none of them had as bad cybersecurity as healthcare. And it's weird because there's a lot of money in healthcare, but the money goes towards the treatments and towards the doctors. And what's also weird is the people in charge in the healthcare industry, the doctors, many of them are very anti-technology. We were working with some doctors on a system for encrypting medical records based on biometrics of the caregiver. And the doctor said, they were very opposed to it. They said, you know, this is going to get in the way. What happens if somebody's not there and then somebody else is there that day and then they can't open the records? And he pointed a finger at me in a very annoyed tone. I'm not making this up. And he said, the day that your security kills one of my patients is the day I get to kick you out of here. You know, it's like they view the technology and the attempt to provide privacy and security as getting in the way of what they want to do, which is treat patients. And so one of the challenges I've had over the last several years is to figure out a way to design solutions where they're a stakeholder, where the doctors are involved in how this gets designed, so it's something they'll actually use. One of the successful examples of that, not my work, not taking credit for it, but of my community putting out something that has been adopted in the hospital is these proximity badge cards. So now at Hopkins, if you're being treated by a medical practitioner, they log into the computer in the room. So you know, you've been a patient, you walk into the room, and there's a computer there, and they open it up, they can look at your x-rays and your records, whatever. That computer at Hopkins will only open and unlock if they've got a proximity card on them and they know the password. And so one of the problems we still have is pretty much 8,000 different people in the hospital can get access to anybody's record. You know? So one of the doctors that I know at Hopkins refuses to be treated at Johns Hopkins because he doesn't want his colleagues to be able to look at his medical records and know everything they can about him. So we're not, you know, there's a lot to do and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think healthcare is behind most of the other verticals. And I don't see it as very likely to change anytime soon because of the mindset, because the money's not going towards it.
Do you spend more time on back-end information kind of systems, or more about on the front end with like devices and medical IoT and things like that, or maybe you do both?
I do both. One of the projects we had in my lab was looking at infusion pumps. And in the old days, an infusion pump is a device that connects to a person and dispenses medication to them. And in the old days, you would get this infusion pump, and you would have to go into the hospital, and they would hook you up, and you would get your medication. Nowadays, you get this thing at home. You can hook yourself up to it. And more scary, the doctor can log into it remotely and change your dosages and see how you're doing, make sure you're taking it. The minute I heard that capability existed, of course, I was like, if the doctor can log in, who else
Remote
can log
access.
into it? Right.
Yeah.
Imagine a terrorist attack where you kill 1 million people in the US because they're all using the same infusion pump that has some firmware with a vulnerability in it, and you exploit it at the same time and give them the wrong medication. So I had a research project designing what we call the Sentinel, which was something that you put on an infusion pump. It was a third-party solution, so it wouldn't matter what type of infusion pump you had, and was doing, we used buzzwords. So we used machine learning to see what is coming in to this infusion pump all day long, and then we say, if we see something that doesn't look like what we usually see, then we stop it, and we raise an alert, and we say, okay, something might be going wrong right now. And you can look at all kinds of things like, even if the traffic's encrypted, you can look at the frequency of packets, the size of packets, you can look at time of day. So there are all kinds of things that you can do to try to do intrusion detection on the communication to the infusion pump. So that was, for example, one type of project we did.
This is going to be a vulnerability for any telemedicine, right? Any kind of, like I know there's a display at Hopkins through the window where there's this operating table.
Yes, my office is right there.
That's such a cool, thing that you guys play around with potential vulnerabilities in an operating room and so on.
We do, yeah.
Pretty frightening. I hope you get that right. Good Lord. So Avi, I asked Dick, I'll give you the opportunity. Caroline's, any great jokes you want to do? A little stand-up, a little election security stand-up?
I told my wife this morning that I was going to be performing at Caroline's Comedy Club in New York. And I said, this is definitely crossing something off of my bucket list. But I'm not going to be performing comedy. I think Dick had the absolute perfect advice, is let the comedians be the comedians. And I do a better job as the nerd, as you called me. And, so, as you called
Didn't you? You had a brush up with the Daily Show.
I did.
Right.
So
tell that story.
This is a fun story. I'm not a comedian, and I was never a guest on the Daily Show like Dick Clark. But I was in Nashville for Passover, and not too many people ever say that. But I was visiting my parents, and it was the, and my parents were hosting the whole family for the Passover Seder, and all of a sudden, towards, I think, the part where we're breaking the matzah or whatever, my cell phone starts going nuts. And what happened was the Daily Show had picked up on our paper, and Ed Helms was playing off of Jon Stewart in a bit where Jon Stewart was asking what's wrong with voting machines, and Ed Helms was literally quoting the most technical parts of our paper, talking about linear congruential generators when used this way, obviously, blah, 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 blah. And Jon Stewart's like, but wait, is voting secure or not? And so he's like, yeah, this and this and this. And so then at the end of the show, Jon Stewart said, and now our moment of Zen. And I had been on 60 Minutes talking about voting, and it was a clip of me on 60 Minutes on CBS saying, any 15-year-old in a garage could hack a voting system of this machine. And that was the moment of Zen, and here I am at Passover, and I'm getting all these texts and calls, so I went and watched it, and I was like, oh my God.
Well, you got to tell the story on the stage at Caroline's. Avi, thanks so much for coming by.
Thank you very much.
Really
it's a pleasure. Thank you.